Good afternoon. I'm Naomi Gilbert. I manage the UK government policy for business and organisational cyber resilience. As you've just heard, I definitely don't have a technical background, so I'm coming from a more policy and government perspective in this, which is part of also why we are opening up today to really start to have a more collaborative and a more partnership approach to developing some of the solutions around software insecurity. So I'm delighted to have the opportunity to talk to you all about the work that my department, the Department for Digital Culture, Media and Support, or perhaps from tomorrow, Science, Innovation and Tech, is doing to make sure that the UK can take advantage of technology whilst keeping people and businesses safe and secure. So I'm really pleased to be here today to be able to contribute to this conversation about some of the challenges we are looking at when it comes to securing the digital supply chain. Not only, but specifically here today, including the software on which we all depend. So we've heard from Andana about quite a specific risk in memory unsafe languages. I think we are at a bit of a slightly different phase of policy making in the UK when it comes to software and open source. And I'm here today to really set out some suggested parameters for a national conversation around those risks and what we should do about them. So we're currently seeking views on the most effective combination of rules, of guidance, of regulation and incentives that we should be deploying in the UK and looking to achieve internationally to try and address the issues that we face in software resilience without stifling innovation or the dynamic industry growth that we can achieve. As others have called for today, any security solutions we push for must be collaborative for them to actually have really any impact in solving some of the security issues we face. So, for those who don't know much about us, to briefly introduce, DCMS, or the Department for Digital Culture, Media and Support, plays a really key role in growing the UK digital economy. We work on issues including tech competition, online safety, data policy and ethics, AI, telecommunications. But we also have a large component and large focus on cybersecurity policy. So a key strategic reference point for our work on cybersecurity is the UK's National Cyber Strategy, the third, I think, of which we released in December 2021, backed by a £2.6 billion investment. So the strategy itself has 5 pillars, and DCMS plays a really central role in 3 of those in particular. The first is around developing the cyber ecosystem, so growing the sector and our skills base. The second is around securing the technology that we use, the everyday technology, and ensuring that that is used to catalyse growth in the economy. Most recently, we've introduced the PSTI Act to ensure that consumer connectable devices, such as smart TVs, some of our fridges, internet connectable cameras, and many of those devices are secure against cyber attack. In December, we also launched a code of practice for app store operators and developers, which sets out minimum security and privacy requirements. So finally, the third area is that DCMS leads the UK's mandate to improve cyber resilience across the economy, which is where I come into this. Across all of those areas, we work very closely with the National Cyber Security Centre as the national technical authority. We also work across the Home Office, Cabinet Office and Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, which so closely that we are probably merging with them today. Today's focus really broaches software's role as both critical technology as well as a determinant of the broader digital resilience of its users. So I'll touch briefly on why we're talking about software security, though I'm conscious that I'm probably preaching a bit to the choir today. As we all know, the software market itself brings huge revenue to the UK, and that's expected to be over £27 billion this year, growing at about 4% annually. It also underpins practically everything we do today. It's the air we now breathe, from Bub's payroll to the nation's electricity grid. It benefits businesses through providing opportunities for growth and innovation, but it also enables greater efficiency of what we already do. The innovation and creativity stemming from software development is central to the strength of our tech sector, and it provides them with the most cutting-edge tools and technologies for businesses to benefit from. Disruption to the functioning of this software, therefore, has the potential to, and has indeed in the past, produced quite wide-ranging and substantial impacts. Within that landscape, we recognise that open source specifically is a fundamental driver of innovation in the UK and globally. Again, preaching to the choir, but the Linux Foundation estimates free and open source software constitutes about 70 to 90% of any given piece of modern software. There were nearly 12 million downloads of open source software packages in January last year alone, and the UK is an important hub for open source development and usage, with enterprises investing around £5 billion in open source software in the UK alone in 2021. So it's clear that open source is a key element of the software ecosystem, and it's clear that the open source community is a crucial contributor to tech in the UK, as we can see here today and tomorrow. So we want to ensure that any policy we develop considers the needs and views of the open source community. It's within that context and understanding of software that we're interested in hearing your views on software security and resilience at all stages of the software lifecycle, from its development through to its distribution and service provision and through to its end use. What I'm here to speak to you about today is not actually the government's plan or strategy for solving the problem. I'm not here to announce anything today, really, but I'm here to ask for collaboration, input, and a partnership in how we both see some of the problems that we face, but also how we develop those solutions. So just yesterday, we've launched a call for views on software security and resilience. This call for views is a consultation putting forth the government's perspective on these views, on risks and some potential solutions, and asking for your input across effectively 3 areas, which are these 3 that are listed. So firstly, the biggest risks and challenges associated with software across the entire life cycle. Secondly, insights on what measures organisations are already taking to mitigate these risks. And finally, views on where further government action could be most effective at improving software security, and feedback on potential policy ideas. I'll briefly touch today on our views on risks, how we're setting out that risk framework, and potential solutions that we are inviting feedback on. I would note the scope of this inquiry and our work is extremely broad. I mentioned the software lifecycle, and we do want to understand the breadth and impact of risks situated at different stages, whether that's from development through to provision and sales through to use, to help target the action that we need to take. I would also mention we are also predominantly here talking about enterprise software, so that used in the context of businesses large and small with this work specifically. So, how we've laid out our view of what risks there are. There are a variety of issues relating to software across the whole life cycle, which range a range of attacks that we've faced recently demonstrate over even just the last couple of years. I'm sure you will have heard these mentioned throughout many of the talks today and probably tomorrow. But the 2021 Kaseya attack saw malicious code injected into the software, and that spread via updates to customers. Many of those customers were managed service providers, which meant the attack spread quickly through software supply chains to their customers as well. This affected quite a high number of businesses, up to around 1,500, including many SMEs who were really hit quite hard through those financial ramifications. These kinds of attacks really emphasize for us the speed and reach of software supply chain attacks. Conversely, Log4j demonstrated actually key transparency issues. Once the vulnerability was identified in the Log4j open source component and made public, that was quite low-hanging fruit for threat actors, and over 800,000 attacks took place in just 72 hours after. Many organizations found it difficult to identify whether they were using the vulnerable code or to track or to fix it if they were. This presents, in some ways, quite different issues to those of the Kaseya case. as I said, this really highlighted issues of transparency and vulnerability management instead. A third attack just last year on NHS 111 software provider Advanced meant that they were then unable to provide their services. And that, again, demonstrates another facet of software resilience, which is the potential severe consequences of disruption to critical services. So my team has been assessing a wide range of these risks, the vulnerabilities that have been exploited, impacts that they've had on both individual level and across the economy, and the surrounding circumstances of the software lifecycle. So from that work, we can try to put forth a software risk framework that can enable further conversations. As you can see, this is comprised of 6 risk areas as we've outlined them in the consultation. And these are broadly related to development in those, the top 2 through to distribution and service provision through to the role of the customer. Firstly, we see multiple risks even just digging under scratching the surface of software development security. These alone are quite diverse, and we're keen to hear views about the respective impact of 3, I think, subcategories of development risk. So these are firstly around accidental vulnerabilities in software code, vulnerabilities introduced while writing new code or introduced from third-party code due to inadequate vetting. The second subcategory there is around intentional compromises of software code by the software developer or by individuals working for that developer. So that can mean backdoors are deliberately designed to allow the developers or others to access data, to alter code, or to inject malicious code later. And the third area there is around insecure development environments. So outside actors being able to inject malicious code into that software that can then spread throughout software supply chains via the distribution of software by suppliers. So it's worth noting, of course, that these issues are relevant to both open source and proprietary software as well. But a key part of that picture is how other software developers use open source code components when developing software. The number of attacks targeting vulnerabilities in open source components is high and growing. Malicious actors are also targeting open source repositories by creating malicious open source software packages that developers inadvertently might include in their software. I've covered just there a very high-level overview of just that first risk outlined. So this is clearly a wide-ranging inquiry and consultation that we're attempting to do. As you can see from those 3 areas of development alone, accidental vulnerabilities, malicious or intentional compromises, and insecure development environments, these risks are extremely different and they require extremely different mitigations, some of which the government may be able to help achieve, but others might be less feasible to directly impact. And this is why it's important that together we start to try to break down some of those risks and specifics that we're talking about if we want to put forward tangible solutions. Whilst there are 6 risk areas outlined here, I want to just touch on a couple more which help demonstrate where open source fits into our understanding of the picture before moving on to examples of potential solutions or policy options that we could take forward. So we've designated a specific risk area for open source in the second risk area outlined here, and this is helping prioritise some of the barriers and challenges faced specifically by the open source community, especially around resourcing and how this can make secure development and maintenance somewhat more difficult at times. We know that vulnerabilities go unnoticed longer in code that doesn't have enough or perhaps doesn't have any maintainers. The time and capacity pressures on the open source community mean that levels of resourcing can be inconsistent, particularly given the need for voluntary participation, and this can make it difficult for secure practices to be followed as standard. But, as I mentioned previously, open source software is essential for growth across the tech sector, and the open source software community is an important source of innovation with contributions bringing new ideas, flexibility and agility to the tech sector. And this is something we absolutely want to protect. We know that the open source community and industry are already taking some steps to introduce more tools and resources to support developers and maintainers, and we are keen to look specifically at what kind of support the open source community needs and how to promote best practice in secure development without putting unnecessary burden on developers and maintainers. Thirdly, then, I'm going to move briefly to transparency and communication and highlighting the risks around the lack thereof sometimes of transparency and communication of software materials, of vulnerabilities, and of incident management. This risk really does penetrate across all the other areas, with implications for how customers manage the risks associated with their use, to how service providers communicate with their clients, and it's a true supply chain issue at heart here. Log4j is a key example of when poor visibility of software supply chains has made it more difficult for organisations to know whether there are vulnerabilities that need to be patched in their estates. The broader point here lies in how information, however, is shared and communicated in software supply chains, and it's not just limited to SBOMs. Customers cannot make informed decisions about managing risk or additional mitigations they might want to take if they aren't made aware of the vulnerabilities or incidents occurring. This issue touches on open source, as much of this information relates to open source components, to how organisations who sell and distribute software manage and maintain those components, and how they communicate any information about vulnerabilities or incidents relating to those components to their customers. I'll leave the overview of some of the risks at that point and move on to possible solutions in these first three risk areas that we're seeking views on, which include quite a wide range of policy options. Given the scope of this work, we're keen to open the discussion on where those priorities should lie when it comes to the risks, what's already out there, what is being used or could be used better of, and any and all alternative solutions. Happy to take your questions at the end of this so we can discuss some ideas and some issues towards the end of this. I'd also flag, though, that we're hosting a workshop tomorrow at 1 p.m, which you can still register for, to start to incite that discussion in a bit more detail with the people here today and tomorrow. As I mentioned earlier, some of the issues relate to how open source software is curated. Vetting, when it comes to software development, could be improved through interventions promoting best practice, but of course, developers who properly vet third-party code are less likely to inadvertently ingest these vulnerabilities or malicious packages. This is considered best practice in secure development, so increasing the uptake of secure development practices more generally could have an impact here. But we are considering a number of supports and incentives for following best practices, and some of those options are up on the screen now. So these are including things like guidance on best practice, for example, a code of practice for software developers, as we've done with other codes of practice over the last few years, or self-assessment tools. Other options can include an international standard for software development practices, pursuing various changes to existing standards, or accreditation in a number of places, either for organisations who adhere to software development best practice or of secure software or systems packages and components, whether open source or proprietary. There are also considerations for support for the development or promotion of tools which can scan software packages and components for known vulnerabilities and indicators of malicious compromise. Finally, I'll just mention financial support for small businesses or startups that develop software according to best practice. But these are just some of the ideas and options and demonstrate the scope that we really are considering for what alternative solutions could look like. It's worth noting when we come to address some of the barriers that the open source community face that we are not currently considering regulation or legislation, as we do want to protect the innovation and growth that open source offers. We are, however, proposing some options in this call for views around how we could support the open source community to help with resourcing or provide guidance or tools. These are including things like guidance on how to increase secure development of software, particularly specifically tailored to the open source community, funding for industry-led initiatives, so those aimed at maintaining critical open source components, or those that develop security tools for use by the open source community, Developing possibly government-backed teams dedicated to maintaining critical open source software components and to support remediation of incidents affecting critical components. And the fourth listed there is around working with industry to develop a mapping tool to understand which open source components might be most critical across the globe. Thirdly, some ideas around addressing transparency. There's, of course, the consideration of how we might best utilise software bills of materials from a government perspective in the UK. But the issues around transparency and communication, as I said, are much wider than SBOMs. This is about how the variety of different responsible actors involved in the software lifecycle communicate with and across one another. So we're also looking at this issue from the perspective of digital supply chains more broadly than software in our team, related to cybersecurity work, and working with procurement and decision makers on how commercial decisions factor in elements of risk. Some of the specific policy options we've included for comment in the consultation do include technical guidance on SBOMs and comparable tools, guidance on best practice in promoting transparency, so attestation, a code of practice for vendors or service providers, or recommended contractual clauses. The certification of software developers, vendors, or service providers who adhere to best practice in promoting transparency. Other options are around establishing secure mechanisms to share information on vulnerabilities and malicious code between developers, researchers, and government. A final one worth mentioning here is the development of regulation that would require software developers and vendors to meet a minimum standard of transparency. So, for example, providing customers with the right to audit or request information, or creating a legal requirement to notify customers of incidents that affect them. There's, of course, also a key question around the potential use or the potential to use many of these tools. Should they be available, would they be used? And what level of skills would be required to help inform end users and equip them to make more informed decisions? Finally, I would reiterate the options that we've presented here and in the rest of the consultation. The call for views is neither exhaustive nor will all be feasible or practicable to pursue. We need to ensure that efforts are best placed and that they're complementary across government, industry and consumers if we're going to tackle some of the systemic challenges that face us today. We want to hear from the open source community in particular, and our key questions here hark back to the broad structure of the consultation, and we're asking from your perspective, where lie the biggest issues impacting software security? We know that industry and open source foundations and bodies are doing great work in this space. Where would further action help most? And finally, how should the government work with the community to address those risks? So I've just reeled off a huge number of options that could be pursued, but thankfully you now have about 12 weeks to read even more of those in the consultation to help with shaping this conversation across the UK and to let us know your thoughts by the 1st of May. We are also open to your ideas and input today. As I said, happy to take questions and through the workshop tomorrow. So please do register for that if you'd like a chance to discuss some of the issues in a fair bit more detail there. I'll close off. I hope this was a helpful contribution to the conversation around software security, the risks and potential solutions, and I hope that this consultation will open the debate more broadly to enable a partnership in generating action. Thank you. I'm not sure how questions are working here, but I don't know. Happy to take any. Have hands up.
So I have a question actually around funding for open source security. At the moment, a lot of the open source foundations, people like the Cloud Native Computing Foundation, rely on resources provided by tech companies, and those obviously will vary depending on those tech companies' priorities. Do you think there's a role for government in actually funding people's work directly on open source security?
I think where there is Funding in government for security that is backed by risk. I think if we can, and talking about from the security perspective specifically, obviously, I think where we can make the case for risks, and that's why I'm talking about identifying the specifics of where those risks impact at an economy-wide level, at a systemic level, there is possible funding routes that we can start establishing throughout government or from government throughout this consultation, really.
So I actually find this really, really interesting because everything that I'm really on the open source side, right, the supply chain side, but the work that you're doing, it's our great opportunity for us to measure pre and post interventions of the supply chain, because the most developer toil, the most wasted human hours on security are at small, mid-sized enterprises. As you build out this plan, what do you intend to measure? Because it's an incredible opportunity, just in terms of your SMEs.
I bring it back to the risks there, which is why we spent so much time developing a framework that we can discuss risks on. And I think where we know that we want to prioritize, we will then baseline, as we do with other general approaches to best practice approaches to policy, we'll baseline what the environment looks like before the intervention is started. So again, that comes down to the risks. And if we are intending to heavily focus on development risks and mitigating some of those, there'll need to be some further studies around efficiencies, effectiveness, what's lost in those cases, and actually what we'd be achieving, because this is exactly why we're pursuing a broader conversation actually around what is the impact of these risks. A key question that we are asking in the consultation is around actually how much impact do you think each of these have, so that we can start prioritising and thinking about where we'll be most effective, rather than saying, as government, we can do this analysis ourselves, because we can't. My background's housing, it's population, ageing. I've been in digital space for quite a while, but for a lot of us, we're not the technical experts. We need your support, your insight. On where we can measure these things most effectively, so that we are not picking and choosing without any evidence.
I don't know if there's a mic. Is that a mic?
It is indeed.
Microphone. I don't have to yell out, although I could.
Hi, I'm Brian Millendorf. I'm Executive Director of the Open Source Security Foundation. One thing that we found effective, merely thinking about government as like a large institution that uses software, right? Forgetting it's like insurer of last resort and provider of public goods kind of roles, but simply as a consumer of software. One comparable structure in the private sector is the Open Source Program Office, right? Which acts from both a policy point of view, in fact, initially as a licensing and kind of compliance kind of role, but increasingly as a channeler of like internal open source creation, not just consumption, and making sure that goes out and upstream in the right place, and increasingly in setting security policies around, you know, which components to consume, how to consume them, how to make sure you're using the most secure approaches to that, and then again, when you go upstream, how to feed those security improvements back upstream if you make any. Is there a similar kind of, I mean, I admit I was sitting here Googling UK OSPO, UK Gov OSPO for a little while, and not feeling like I found a great part of the UK government that acted in, again, when it comes to procurement and IT management, which I get is perhaps outside the remit of your ministry, but thinking about where is that vector, like where is that internal accountability? Because what I found really helpful about the White House Executive Order 14028 was how it attached SBOMs, the promotion of SBOMs to procurement as the carrots to bring things in, rather than as a regulatory, everybody must issue SBOMs, right? Instead, it was when we use the purse of the government, we're going to prefer and eventually require software bill of materials. And so, do you see, like, either within your organization or complementary organizations, that same kind of funnel, that same kind of channel, and a way to lever the purse of the government and its own use of software to achieve the objectives you want to see?
Definitely. The easy answer is definitely. So we work very closely, as I said, with a few of the other government departments, specifically Cabinet Office. So the Government Security Group team within Cabinet Office is responsible for the security of government, central departments and arm's length bodies. We work with them at the moment, what we have as it comes to all procurement across government. So we're not talking about necessarily critical services, but your general procurement is the requirement to have cyber essentials or to be cyber essentials certified. We are working with them in some earlier stages actually of how we mature that approach, knowing that it's not a one-size-fits-all. So we work quite closely as well with the Ministry of Defence. Obviously, they have a higher risk rationale as to why they will need higher level assurances and accreditations in what they're procuring from. But yes, that is exactly one route, and that is the route that we used when introducing the Cyber Essentials certification scheme in 2014 to start solidifying and utilising the government's purchasing power itself as one of our main levers that we can use to change behaviours. So in assessing with the Government Security Group a more mature approach to security in our procurement, this is definitely something that we are exploring with them, what we could be making requirements and demands of, and definitely linking the consultation through with collaborative policy working with them as well.
Hi, Sharif Mansour, Director of Information Security at JustEatTakeaway.com. From the slide, when you were looking at development, deployment, and the role of the individuals, I was also interested about also the role of law enforcement, especially in the case of cybercrime. Because at the moment, I think a lot of the cases that would go to local law enforcement, and if there's an issue of actually understanding or having the capability to react to it, it just gets dropped. And some of the signals there are incredibly valuable for the government to also know how to react or chase up specific threat actor groups. So I was wondering if that is something that the government has looked into as well, in order to at least record that in order to make risk-based decisions on what to investigate.
Yeah, so we have been working behind the scenes for a number of years to try to establish a common database that we can be using across Home Office and particularly the National Cyber Security Centre, so that there can be communication as the Home Office manage the law enforcement side of things. There are some, I suppose, practical difficulties in sharing data and in collaborating and putting that together into one database. But we also often have the problem of a lack of reporting. So there's not necessarily great reporting sometimes of certain crimes. It depends on actually what level of crime we're talking about here. But there's a few different barriers that we come up against when collating that information. Is the question, around how we respond best to different crimes that are happening?
Yeah, I think the spirit of the intent is that entire loop that you're referring to, right? And first of all is companies and people only report what they basically have to are required to, right? So they keep it to an absolute minimum, even just as a best practice. So it's like, what do you need in order to make informed decisions, and the information sharing, and that for you then to be able to reduce also the number of attack groups, or at least take on the ones that and have the information you need in order to make the necessary investigations as well.
Yeah, so I will have to, in some ways, defer to the law enforcement side of things, and I can potentially come back to you and engage you in that conversation with Home Office and law enforcement. But how we prioritise the criminal aspects of it, and actually the law enforcement side, is something that we work more around the sidelines with. But the Computer Misuse Act is also out for consultation on what they're looking to prioritise and reform in this. And this is also something that we're quite plugged into and in constant conversation also, in terms of ensuring that we aren't criminalising sharing of data, conversely as well, to make sure that aspects, or if we are to mandate something like an SBOM, even in government-owned procurement, that doesn't then misalign with some of the CMA criminal acts as well. But I'll have to leave it there on law enforcement, sorry.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you.
Yes, hello. I'm Ian Mitchell, KC, and I'm on KC to the Open UK. But another hat that I wear is I'm the past chair, now current chair, of the Surveillance Working Group of the Council of Bars and Law Societies of Europe. And I raise that specifically because, and I know it's, so you've mentioned the issue with law enforcement, and but there is maybe a question you can answer. And that is, I know from the work that I do in Europe that there is a constant tension between, on the one hand, removing barriers, having interoperability, having high security encryption, so on and so forth, removing vulnerabilities. But you find coming from the law enforcement, and more particularly the security services side, a constant pressure for ensuring that there are suitable back doors so the, quote, good guys, unquote, can use them. Of course, it's incoherent and nonsense to be suggesting you can do such a thing safely because it's only technology and it's transparent. It doesn't make moral values. But within the UK government, are you aware of any dialogue going on between these two imperatives? The one that you've very, very clearly expounded and expressed today in the DCMS are seriously consulting on, and then whatever might be happening down at GCHQ.
So are you talking about removing backdoors versus the need for backdoors?
Yeah, well, that's it. The discussion going on, you see, because a backdoor is always a vulnerability. I mean, you cannot have a secure backdoor. The only secure backdoor is not having one at all. But there is a constant struggle going on with, I'm not saying necessarily our security services, but with security services around the world, that, we want to get the bad guys. They use all these highly encrypted messaging channels to do their dirty work. And there's one particular Belgian prosecutor who always gives a Dirty Harry speech in any platform I've shared with him. It's along the lines of, give us the tools and we'll keep you safe. And I'm just wondering if there is that kind of dialogue happening within the UK government, so far as you're aware, and how does the DCMS confront that if such suggestions are made?
No, we haven't had any. We have not had any as yet. Obviously, constant conversation with the National Cybersecurity Centre as the technical authority on this, on any cybersecurity matters. So we do have a coordinated reach across their accreditation services, engagement services, their capability and research services, who are all feeding into this work on software, but they have not raised any of these issues or concerns from the GCHQ perspective or the security services perspective as yet. So I suspect as we get further down into the possibility of potential proposals that we do want to take forward, the nitty-gritty of some of those divides and trade-offs will probably occur a little further down the line, I'd say.
Thanks. Hi, Simon Hart from Innovate UK. I'd be interested to know with the consultation, what type of organisation are you looking for in responses? And the reason I ask that is I've recently been involved in the cyber-physical consultation through BASE, or I think we're potentially now the same department. Do you want SMEs targeted? Do you want to target the open source community in the UK, or is it the larger corporates? Because you can typically find that the smaller companies may struggle to find the time to actually complete such a consultation. So just interested to know what you're looking for with it.
Of course, and that's exactly where we'll need to be working more through the likes of yourselves, through Tech UK, through others, to reach those smaller audiences so that there is a force to feed in. But the answer is everyone. The scope is really large, but this is exactly so we have included a few demographic questions. I say business demographic questions, and they are really, really important to us to fill that out so that we can start understanding from the SME perspective or from the larger corporate perspective what's that looking as an aggregate picture as to how they view the risks and to how they view some of the barriers to those solutions. So we definitely, I think, we are naturally probably going to get a lot more responses from developers. I would say perhaps less so on those that are representing customers and end users, just because that is such an undefined and broad, that's every single one of us. So we probably will, we've got an engagement plan with a variety of workshops with different types of audiences and those that we want to feed in over the next 3 months. So we're trying to actively target those that we don't think will necessarily feed in. As I said, the customers and end users might be a little less vocal than the big corporates, but the answer is everyone. And we'll try and really split it out when we come out to sharing the results of the analysis and consultation, is really split out views on those different perspectives as well, especially where their views on the impact of the risks, where they do or where they don't differ according to size and type of organisation as well.
I'm cheating by holding the microphone. Firstly, apologies for setting off my find your YubiKey during Sal's question. From a sort of socio-technical perspective, then the generation of SBOMs and the threat model that follows that is currently not looking at insider threats or malicious generation of SBOMs. So one of the questions that you asked sort of out to the community about where are SBOMs centralized or stored or secured, does your department have a view on whether that should be something, could that be a public good service that's provided by the government, or are there any ideas around that initially?
The ideas are very wide-ranging and open. I don't think we are really trying to go into this honestly open and not actually saying, we already know we're going to regulate so-and-so and we're going to go and do this and that. So this is really trying to have a collaborative conversation on it. So I'd say that may or may not be helpful, but we don't necessarily have a view. We are open to those kinds of possibilities. And as I said, we are open to resourcing questions as well. So if that means resourcing new teams within government, or if that means funding and resourcing for foundations, for community out there, definitely that's in scope and possible. I think the one pushback I'd say that we have had around using SBOMs is really around what I mentioned around skill sets and who can use them and who can read them and who can do what with them. So we need to also be thinking about some of those flow-on implications, which is not unlike us when we're providing any set of guidance. Actually, do organisations have the skills to ingest this information? Do they have the skills to be able to respond to this, to implement this guidance? Do they have the resources to do so? So those two questions around resourcing and skills, as well as the development and production or mandate of anything, need to be hand in hand.
Right, with that, thank you very much. A round of applause, please.